The Syrian War, once the defining conflict of the 2010s, resurfaced in global headlines when a shocking rebel offensive defied all expectations and caught Bashar al-Assad's loyalist forces off guard. The jihadist group HTS has reshaped Syria's conflict, effectively overthrowing the Assad regime. This historic overthrow reshapes Syria's future and raises crucial questions. What sparked this upheaval, and what comes next for Syria? To understand the full scope of these events, let's first examine the causes of the Syrian civil war. The Syrian war is one of the most complex conflicts to unravel, with numerous factions vying for power. It all began in 2011 during the Arab Spring, a wave of uprisings that challenged authoritarian regimes across North Africa and the Middle East, including in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, and Syria. Syria, ruled with an iron grip by the al-Assad family since 1970, was no exception. At the time, the country was led by Bashar al-Assad, son of former dictator Hafez al-Assad. Despite being officially a secular republic governed by the Ba'ath Party, the regime was widely seen as a sectarian dictatorship dominated by the Alawite minority, a Shiite sect to which the Assad family belonged. This alienated the Sunni majority, which made up around 74% of the population. Marginalized politically and economically, most Sunnis lived in impoverished rural areas or neglected urban neighborhoods, plagued by poverty and unemployment. When the Arab Spring ignited, discontented Sunnis quickly rose up against Assad's rule. The regime responded with brutal repression, sparking a violent backlash. Protesters took up arms, and many soldiers defected to join the opposition. This chain of events plunged Syria into a bloody civil war that has continued since 2011. At the outset of the Syrian civil war, the conflict pitted Bashar al-Assad's government forces against the rebels, initially united under the banner of the Free Syrian Army. Assad had three key allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah in Lebanon, while the rebels initially gained significant backing from Middle Eastern powers. These countries viewed the rebels as a critical tool to weaken Iran's Shiite influence in the region. Early on, the rebels also garnered widespread support from the West. Presenting themselves as fighters for freedom and democracy, they secured backing from the European Union and especially the United States, led by President Obama. Talks of arming the rebels openly circulated in the West, posing a serious threat to Assad's regime. In response, Assad executed a calculated strategy. He released jihadists from Syrian prisons. While this move risked future challenges from these extremists, it effectively muddied the waters for Western powers. The presence of jihadists made it politically and morally difficult for the West to continue supporting the rebels. Over time, the rebel movement splintered. Radicalization set in, with various factions developing their own agendas and forging independent alliances. This fragmentation led to the division of the rebel side into 4 distinct subgroups, further complicating an already chaotic conflict. First, there were the Free Syrian rebel factions, moderate secular groups advocating for a democratic system. These factions received significant weaponry and support from Western nations. Second, more Islamist-oriented rebel groups emerged. Many of these groups aligned themselves with Turkey, which provided funding, weapons, and strategic directives. These groups later formed the Syrian National Army, essentially serving as proxies for Turkish President Erdogan, often acting as his enforcers. The third faction consisted of ultra-radical Islamists who joined the Nusra Front, initially an affiliate of the notorious terrorist group responsible for the 9/11 attacks. However, the Nusra Front eventually severed ties with its parent organization, forming its own network. It merged with other extremist groups to create Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the group that ignited again this conflict. Finally, the fourth group was the Islamic State, composed of the most extreme rebels. At its peak, ISIS controlled a vast territory home to over 8 million people. Although its territorial hold has been obliterated, it continues to operate clandestinely, weakened, and waging a war against virtually everyone. In this context, we also have another crucial player, the Kurds. The Kurdish people are the largest stateless population in the world, living across 4 countries: Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and northern Syria. Relations between the Kurds and these governments have historically been fraught, particularly with Turkey, where hostility towards the Kurds runs deep. Similarly, the Assad regime in Syria marginalized the Kurds, excluding them politically and economically, and brutally suppressing any dissent. When ISIS advanced and threatened Kurdish territories, viewing the Kurds as apostates to be eradicated, Assad's Syrian army retreated, abandoning the Kurds to their fate. In response, the Kurds organized and established their own forces, the male YPG and female YPJ militias. Known for their progressive values and resilience, the Kurds found a strong ally in the United States, which supported them in the fight against ISIS. This partnership flourished, leading to the formation of the Syrian Democratic Forces, a coalition that combined Kurdish fighters with the most democratic rebel factions. Together, they expanded their campaign against ISIS, strengthening their presence in northeastern Syria and carving out a degree of autonomy in the region. In summary, the Syrian conflict involves several key factions with different international backers. The Assad government is supported by Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. The Syrian Democratic Forces, a coalition of Kurdish groups and democratic rebels, receive backing from the United States. The Syrian National Army, formed by Turkish-aligned Islamist rebels, represents another significant faction. Meanwhile, extremist jihadists regrouped under the banner of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the Islamic State. Hostilities dominate the landscape, with alliances formed more out of necessity than trust. Almost no one gets along. The only factions that occasionally tolerate each other are the Turkish-backed SNA and HTS, though even this relationship is tenuous. Most factions are locked in animosity, but the Syrian civil war has repeatedly shown that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, at least temporarily. For example, Assad's forces have at times cooperated with the Kurds to push back Turkish-backed rebels. By 2019, the conflict had entered a quieter phase. Assad's forces, with significant help from allies, had regained much of the territory. The SDF controlled large areas in the northeast, including critical oil fields. The Turkish-backed rebels secured their position in northern Syria, and HTS solidified its strongholds in the province of Idlib. The one faction left without a significant foothold was the Islamic State, whose territorial control had been entirely dismantled. Everything seemed to suggest that the tense calm in Syria could last forever, but that was not to be. The jihadist rebels of HTS had been preparing and arming themselves for some time, waiting for the right moment, and that moment arrived in 2024. By then, the war in Ukraine had drained much of Russia's military resources. The Kremlin was forced to withdraw its paratroopers, its Wagner mercenaries, and a significant portion of the Syrian Air Force to bolster its efforts in Ukraine. Iran, too, was stretched thin, occupied with supporting its axis of resistance allies and preparing for a potential conflict with Israel. Meanwhile, Hezbollah had been left weakened and shocked by its recent clashes with Israel, far from the strength it once enjoyed. Seizing this opportunity, HTS insurgents breached Aleppo, Syria's largest city, marking the first entry since 2016. Soon after, they captured most of the city, forcing pro-government forces to retreat. HTS-led opposition forces also seized Hama, Syria's fourth-largest city, after government troops withdrew. HTS forces, in a coordinated assault with the Syrian Democratic Forces, seized control of Deir ez-Zor in a powerful push east of the Euphrates River. Meanwhile, in the south of Syria, HTS, alongside the Southern Operations Room and Al-Jabal Brigade, took Dara and Suwaida. Following the fall of key cities, the rebels launched an offensive that resulted in the capture of Damascus and Homs, the last strongholds of the Assad regime. With the loss of these critical cities, the regime has collapsed, signaling the definitive end of Assad's rule and a dramatic shift in Syria's power dynamics. The rapid collapse of the Assad regime can be explained by a combination of internal decay, strategic failures, and the relentless pressure of external forces. For years, Assad's military was built on a fragile foundation, relying on militias, local warlords, and foreign forces to maintain control. This patchwork structure ultimately left the regime vulnerable to collapse. Over time, the regime's morale and cohesion deteriorated, especially as it failed to rebuild Syria or reform its military. The country's infrastructure was shattered, and with the war dragging on, corruption and infighting became rampant. Commanders, often more interested in personal gain, sold supplies and extorted civilians, eroding the very foundations of the state. This created a psychological domino effect, where the Assad regime's legitimacy crumbled, further emboldening opposition forces. At the same time, Assad's reliance on foreign support from Russia and Iran began to falter. The Russians, stretched thin by the war in Ukraine, could no longer afford to support Syria as they once had. Meanwhile, the axis of resistance, with its focus on Israel, failed to provide the stability Assad needed. As the rebel forces gained ground, momentum built, and more insurgents joined the fight, creating a snowball effect that was increasingly hard to stop. This shift in momentum was not just psychological, it was rooted in material realities. Assad's resources dwindled while the opposition gained strength. The rebels' ability to quickly capitalize on Assad's military weaknesses and the unrelenting pace of their advance overwhelmed the regime. By the time HTS and other rebel groups captured key cities, Assad was left with few options. His forces, already fractured and demoralized, could no longer stem the tide of insurgent advances. The regime's inability to prevent this, especially in the north, led to a rapid disintegration of what little control it had left. In the end, it was a perfect storm of psychological factors, material decline, and strategic missteps that brought down Assad's reign. Whether the rebels can hold the territory they've captured is still uncertain, but for now, Assad's grip on power has completely evaporated, leaving his future in Syria no longer a matter of possibility, but of history. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time here on Histopedia for more geopolitics videos.